Susan, we think we're special as a species. We think humans are far above everyone else. Some religious groups would invest us with all sorts of relationships to higher powers. Biologists see a continuum through evolution. How then do we look at human beings from a scientific point of view, particularly from a neuroscience point of view, to see where we are on the evolutionary scale? Is it completely linear, or when we see the human mentality and culture so vastly different from animals, it seems discordant with what seems to be a very linear biology?
No, I agree. And the standard answer, which I'm going to modify, is, oh, well, we use language, or we're self-conscious and we're conscious of ourselves. Now, we know the famous experiments with the chimps where you can paint a red dot on their forehead and they will look in the mirror, and suggesting that they are aware of who they are. So it's not just that, and it's certainly not language, because what about a very small baby? They're not human until they're 2 years old. Well, again, and also they're not self-conscious till they're 2 or 3 years old. So what status would they have? Yeah? So why is then a human different? And I think, for me, the most persuasive argument has come from someone called Stephen Mythen, who wrote a book called The Prehistory of the Mind. He's actually an archaeologist, and quite often, as you'll find, other areas, other disciplines can offer, trigger in your own mind an exciting train of thought that wasn't there within your own discipline. And what Mythen suggested is very interesting. He said, why is it that chimpanzees, for example, live in complex hierarchies? They're highly dexterous creatures. They have complex relationships. And yet, you never see a chimpanzee with a symbol of tribal status around his neck. You never see a chimpanzee make a necklace because he's the boss. It would be a he, of course. He's the boss chimpanzee. You never see that. And yet, since Neanderthal times, we've had cave art, and apparently there's signs that burial rituals, even in very, very primitive ancestors. So what he suggests, and I find this perhaps the key to everything, is that human beings, unlike chimpanzees, think metaphorically. We can see one thing in terms of something else. We can think in terms of a symbol, something standing for something. And of course, that's what language is, but it's just a subset of that. It's what living flowers is, yeah? And as soon as you have a language, of course, you can then have a sense of yourself as opposed to someone else. So my own view, echoing Mythen's, is that, yes, it comes again with the connectivity of seeing one thing in terms of something else. And given that our brains undergo an astonishing growth compared to a chimpanzee brain. We're born with pretty much the same size. A chimp baby and a human baby is pretty much the same size brain. Human brain expands due to the connections, in turn, therefore, enabling us to think metaphorically, to use symbols in a way that a chimp never will. So you see it in the increasing connections in the brain enable us to see increasing connections, but then the difference between seeing increasing connections on a linear scale and then using metaphor, which is of a different kind. Yeah. So I'm looking for the difference between a spectrum and what we call a step function, spectrum going linearly or whatever, and a step function suddenly jumping. Yeah, to see one thing in terms of something else. That's a fundamental difference. That's the fundamental difference. It's a little bit like my little brother interpreting Macbeth as out, brief candle, as literally a candle, or making the connection that it actually is connected or related or similar to death. You know? And or to say, that you can do a letter or a cave drawing, and that stands for something. That's the conceptual leap, that one thing can stand for something else, that a necklace can stand for power. And is that something that you can relate directly to increasing brain capacity? Is it a one thing? Is it a cultural thing that's learned? Is it that somebody just accidentally did at some point and then everybody else learned it? Or is it something that's innate in everyone because of the brain? Can you begin to ask these questions? Well, again, I'm parroting Stephen Mythen, but he goes back to archaeological times, and that would suggest it is part of our birthright. It's been part of our birthright since even the Neanderthals, our predecessors, were there, because you can look at cave art, and ubiquitous in the relics of human civilization, that's what it is, are the marks. Unlike, you don't have chimpanzee civilization. What is it special? It's because we have used one thing to stand for something else. Now, how that is instantiated in the brain, I have no idea. I know I can give the hazy argument that it's to do with connections. It may also be to do with the growth of this frontal part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is 33% of the human brain, but only 17% of the chimp brain.
And in absolute size, it's even more than that.
Yeah, and it's very much an evolutionary Johnny come lately. And sadly, it's become the kitchen sink of neuroscience, in that any function, you don't know what it does, you put it in the prefrontal cortex. Anything that's cognitive or higher or fancy, you put it in the prefrontal. Now, I think that's a very naive view of brain function. I think what the prefrontal cortex does is to so configure the state of the brain by virtue of how the different brain regions connect that it enables you to do things you couldn't do otherwise. We know when it's damaged, for example, you're living much more in the moment, you're much more reckless, you're much more in the here and now. Just an interesting aside, obese people have a less active prefrontal cortex, and I think it's because the thrill of the food trumps the consequences. So that's perhaps another story. But
well, we can look at the prefrontal lobes, because I want to focus on this the concept of representation and metaphor as a key, as a human key, and so the prefrontal cortex has the capacity to differentiate and to and in some cases where you have injury and trauma to the prefrontal cortex, is people lose their ability to be insightful or to see metaphor. We see in patients with autism or different syndromes in that spectrum, where they can interpret things literally, but can't interpret things metaphorically or in relationships or jokes or things don't make sense, but literally they can be very intelligent. And a lot of times people relate that to forebrain miswirings.
Yeah. Well, of course, the famous case that you'll know of is Phineas Gage, who everyone's heard of, but it's a macabre story and therefore worth repeating, of how in the 1860s in Vermont, he was pushing down explosive with a so-called tamping iron, a big rod. Explosive went off prematurely, drove the tamping iron through his prefrontal cortex, and amazingly he didn't die. And in those heartless days he had to go back to work, and it was only as the days turned to weeks that his colleagues noticed he had changed his character, he'd become irascible and profane and childlike in many ways, but above all more reckless. And this is not good, of course, if you work with explosives. So he actually became a fairground freak, showing off his wound. And sadly, this syndrome, this so-called frontal syndrome, was repeated with the wars, when you had people with shrapnel damage to that part of the brain. So we know that when the brain is damaged, certain things ensue. As you say, people are more reckless, they're much more childlike. And my own view is that given that part of the brain has evolution reflected in development, it only comes in stream in late teenage years, and it's so different from the chimpanzee brain, that what this does is enable you to escape from the press of the moment. So you have a notion of consequence, you have a past, a present, and a future. Now, what's very interesting, another issue that if it's damaged you can get is something called source amnesia. That is to say, you forget certain things, but out of context. So you can remember things in a generic way, but you can't remember the context. You lack the space-time coordinates, So your memory then would be perhaps like a small child, very small child's, or on animals, where you have a generic, hazy recollection or association of something happening, but not knowing when or where in a particular episode in your life. So I think this prefrontal cortex, in ways that we poorly understand at the moment, coordinates the rest of the brain. But what it does and what it enables you to do is have a notion of a narrative, which you don't have in very small children, which you don't have in animals, and perhaps very, very in a very primitive and early stage in chimps. But what makes us special? What makes us special is not just thinking metaphorically, but by so doing, we can escape from the moment. And again, one can think about screen technologies. I think that perhaps if screen technologies are imposing an environment that's in the here and now, always, that's very literal, that's in your face, perhaps people will stay as frontal people. They won't develop a notion of consequence or a notion of a past, a present, and a future. That's my kind of gloomy, one gloomy Armageddon scenario. But certainly, what makes us human? It would be a tautology to say it's a prefrontal cortex. And that's a sort of non-argument, because I don't think brain regions have autonomous functions. But I think it is to do with thinking metaphorically, seeing one thing in terms of another, and therefore seeing yourself in terms of a past and a future in a very sort of deep and profound way.